In Greek mythology, there's a story about this narrow ocean strait that Jason and the Argonauts had to sail through at one point. And it's this narrow ocean strait, and on one side is a snarling sea wolf monster called Scylla, and on the other side there is this whirling whirlpool called Charybdis. And you had to chart this narrow course right in between the snarling jaws of Scylla and the wild whirlpool Charybdis, monsters on both sides, and it felt like avoiding one to go to the other might end up with you ensnared in the other instead. And sometimes we know this feeling when we're in our lives. We know this feeling of being locked in a situation where trying to please one side ends up offending another, or trying to attempt to do good seems offset by harm, or whether there's this narrow path that it feels like we're stuck in. We have ways of describing this, like being between a rock and a hard place, or choosing between the lesser of two evils, or being caught in a catch-22. It feels as if we are condemned if we do, and condemned if we don't sometimes. In our text today, in the Matthew text, Jesus knew this feeling of feeling vexed, of feeling trapped, of feeling as if you just can't win, as if nothing is ever good enough. In today's text, Jesus is speaking to the crowds about John the Baptist. And Jesus said that John came neither eating nor drinking. And so then people dismiss John, saying he has a demon. And so then Jesus comes to the people, and Jesus comes both eating and drinking, and yet the people dismiss Jesus, saying that Jesus was a glutton and a drunkard. And so we can sense Jesus' frustration here. God sent John to the people to prepare the way for Jesus, and John's fasting just wasn't good enough. So then Jesus comes to the people himself. And now Jesus eats with them, but the fact that Jesus didn't fast, well, Jesus' eating wasn't good enough. Eating or no eating, both John and Jesus couldn't win. Nothing was ever good enough. Now, in this time, we have this sense for Jesus of being frustrated, that he was condemned if he ate, and condemned if, and John showed that he was condemned if he didn't. Same with drinking, same with being with the people. Now, in that time period, many of the people would have known about Greek philosophy. And Greek philosophy has something of an answer between these two competing ends. And Aristotle and others espouse this idea of there being a golden mean. And that golden mean is where virtue, where good behavior, where the right way to live could be found. That narrow path between things on one end and things on the other, excesses in both directions. So for an example, take a virtue like courage. Courage is a good thing. That is this moderation in the middle here. But if you have too much courage, you become rash, you become dangerous, you become foolhardy. If you have too little courage, you can be cowardly or complacent. And in between that on one end, cowardly and complacent, and rash and foolhardy, there in the middle stands courage. And you can do that with any other kinds of virtue. This was the part of the ethical teaching of Greeks, of Aristotle especially. And so too much something, too little something, something right in the middle, a golden mean. Virtue was to be found between the extremes. And so just like how people lived was just like that story in Greek mythology. We're to pilot our ship straight down that middle, making constant adjustments to avoid being sucked into vice on one end or the other. Excess, we might even say sin, that comes from drifting too far either direction. In this thinking, this journey between the two monsters represents this ideal that somehow between two sets of evils is a path, however thin, to be where you can avoid both of them. Now, we can again see this in the stories of Jesus and John. Jesus and the crowds were considering John. John was not a man of moderation, this Greek philosophical ideal. John was a man who exceeded excessive behavior in every single way. John was a man who shunned the city and went out to live in the wilderness. He was a man who shunned normal behavior and wore rough skins instead of normal clothes. He ate honey and locusts instead of anything normal. And so many did not see that John exemplified wisdom because he was far from moderate. And so John ended up being imprisoned because his words condemned the ruling authorities. So we can imagine those crowds of people. That John had been here before, and John's results, the fact that he was imprisoned and later killed, kind of bear out the idea that wisdom was found in moderation, going down the middle, not sticking your head out too far. And we can imagine those crowds might have tried to soften John in his day, to kind of say, hey, right now you're at scary, and maybe you could move it down to just challenging. Or maybe you could just tone down the message so it's not offending everybody, it seems like. Or at least just loosen up on your followers. Let them eat and drink because this honey and locusts doesn't call anyone in. And so then Jesus comes in to this same general time period with this same general group of people. And Jesus also is a man who doesn't seem to be acting in moderation at all either. Jesus is a man who exceeds convention, not the ways that John did, but in a way all his own. Jesus loved the whole city abundantly. Jesus loved even those whom others scorned. Jesus loved the tax collectors. Jesus loved the sinners. The sinners. How immoderate does that seem, to go up and love those outcasts in society? In Jesus, the crowd saw a man who eats and drinks more normally. Sure, this was better than John perhaps, but a man who does so with others, with tax collectors, in a way that starts to seem too much. It's tacky, it's overabundant, this love that Jesus shows for embracing all. And so, just like the crowds might have counseled John to just turn it down a little bit, find that golden mean, we can imagine Jesus' disciples and the crowds around Jesus saying, hey, go easy on all this. Everybody agrees that those people over there aren't worth our time. Go easy on this embrace of all. You don't have to declare your love for everyone all at once. And so today, in that Matthew text, we read Jesus' reply to these crowds, to those who looked at John and saw excess, and therefore did not see the wisdom of John. For those who looked at Jesus and were seeing excess and not seeing the wisdom in Jesus. And so in this text, Jesus says that wisdom is vindicated by her deeds. In other translations, it comes across as wisdom is proved right, proved correct by her works. So, John the Baptist's chief vice was an overabundance of truth. The crowds around Jesus saw in Jesus an overabundance of love. And both of those things, while truth and love are good things, both of these people had turned them up to excess. And so they were outside the bounds of that good and virtuous behavior. And both confounded any sense of shunning excess. They weren't going to turn themselves down at all. And so they challenged ideas that people had about how they should live, how we should live too in our own time. And yet for all of this, as Jesus said, wisdom is proved right by her works. John's prophetic truth proves the correctness of what he was saying. And Jesus's world-changing, abundant, bountiful love, how could there be ever an excess of that? Their wisdom is proved right by their works. This is something that we can also feel in our lives and in our history together, that where that narrow, moderate path may have been the best way, that happens sometimes, but there are other times when the actions would have felt so out of the realm of possibility, excessive, that it would have felt crazy in the time, and yet wisdom is proved right by her works. This week, we celebrated just such an action, this immoderate act in our own nation's history. Now, we believe generally, broadly, that there was a lot of wisdom in those early founders and framers of our country, those that came together with this idea of freedom, of equality, of justice under the law. And so we might consider these people to be paragons of virtue, that they were wise, that they were courageous. But in 1776, so many of the peers of Franklin and Washington and Jefferson, Adams, all of these, so many of their peers around them would not have seen them as wise, but would have seen them as foolhardy, would have seen them as not courageous, going beyond courage to the foolish. They would have viewed them with the kind of skepticism that it sounds like the crowds were viewing John and Jesus. These people, they were immoderate, they were excessive, they were not virtuous. They should have been patient, or they should have been calmer. They should not have provoked in such a way. And yet, the fact we still celebrate them so long later is proof of that idea that wisdom is proved right by her works. We might also find this at times in our lives today. There are times when the path forward is not found in some narrow tightrope between parties in conflict. When the path forward is not found in moderation, in who can we least offend, how can we shrink ourselves down, but instead is lived out in a passionate commitment to truth, to love. We know personally that that can be the case. We know from our lives the times that truth and love outweigh what we should have been doing, or what would have been proper, or would have been the moderate course of action. There are times in our lives when we've made what feel like poor decisions by any context, and yet that poor decision is what led to our chosen career, or our fastest friends, or our lifelong partner, the love of our lives, our happiest moments. These can come out of living boldly, committing to love, committing to truth. The moments of rash decision, the moments where we follow our gut, the moments where we feel called, led, instead of where propriety, where moderation, where good taste would lead us. And in those times in our lives, Jesus reminds us that wisdom is proved right by its works. We can see this way when we seek not to offend others with political viewpoints, or when we seek not to confront things head on, but instead try to find a better path around. And yet, sometimes that rush forward, that commitment, that passionate embrace of love, of truth, a commitment to those things, is the true act, the true wisdom proved right sometime down the road in hindsight. We know that the way to wisdom, that the way to living a good life, to living an ethical life, is not always through these clean categories that Aristotle laid out. We also know that what is proved wise by hindsight is not always clear in foresight. It remains difficult to bridge that gap between hindsight and foresight, what we wish we could have done back then and the options we thought we had back then to go forward. So we often find ourselves trapped between these two competing monsters in whatever ways, between two evils, staring down monsters on both sides. The wisdom of hindsight is not yet on our side. And that wisdom is really good so much of the time. There is wisdom in moderation. There is wisdom in trying to act virtuously and not to be excessive in so many ways. And yet sometimes that pursuit of that moderation, that pursuit of that golden mean, that pursuit itself can start to be a difficulty on top of whatever difficulties we're working our way through. Because seeking that moderation, seeking that golden mean, can lead us into over-considering in any given moment. The idea of trying to calibrate between recklessness on one end and overconfidence and humility and doing right by one person or doing right by another, doing right by ourselves, doing right by our call, doing right by our values, all of these competing claims on us. Well, if we're trying to chart that narrow course, all of a sudden we're charting a course between so many competing things that all that can start to weigh as a burden. How can we live a good life? And so that burden becomes its own burden, that wondering. We start to create laws for ourselves. We try to, for ourselves personally, try to create rules of conduct to say that, okay, in this situation I'll do this, and I'll do this, and I'll do this. And all of that becomes a set of burdens, a set of demands upon us. And we find ourselves even more so in one of those condemned if you do, condemned if you don't situations, out of our own creation this time. We so often end up being our own condemners. We become our own judges. We sit in judgment of ourselves. We're guilty of ignoring our own good motivations and instead punishing the actions that with hindsight we think were too much. And in this text, in addition to Jesus calling people to live passionately, to love without fear of being excessive, to commit to truth without being excessive, I think Jesus is also seeking to relieve us of this burden, of all of these competing claims on our lives, all the competing choices. Do we buy fair trade or organic or support local? All of these different things that start to build up on us and weigh on us. It's this tendency to judge ourselves, to live in criticism of self that I think Jesus sees as part of our burden that he talks about in this text. That we are so burdened by trying to be good, to walk that narrow tightrope of virtue. Jesus sees this, sees the burdens we carry with us, and Jesus says to the crowds, says to us in this time, "Come to me, all you who are burdened, who are weary and carrying heavy burdens. Come to me," Jesus says, "and I will give you rest." Jesus sees all those laws we pile up on ourselves, all the difficult courses we try to chart. Jesus takes those laws, takes the law of keeping everyone happy, pleasing everyone, not offending, doing the right thing, living a good life. Jesus takes all those laws and restrictions we lay upon ourselves and replaces them with one great commandment: to love the Lord our God with our heart and soul and mind, and to love our neighbor as ourselves. This is it. That is our call. That is the burden. And so with Christ, walking with Christ in our lives, we are freed from that condemned if you do, condemned if you don't. We are freed into a life of freedom that's found by following God's call in our lives. To love our neighbor exuberantly, to love God deeply, to show love to our neighbors and to ourselves. And so when we seek to do that, when we follow that, these dilemmas, these places where we feel trapped or conflicted, become transformed. Our challenges are released. Our burdens get taken up as we pray, as we seek forgiveness, as we seek to forgive others, as we seek to forgive ourselves. The truth is that we are called to live boldly into God's love. We are called to share that love with our neighbors, and neighbors most broadly, neighbors that live next to us, but our neighbors who are different from us, of different color or background, gender, identity, any of these. We are called to love our neighbors exuberantly. We are called to forgive boldly. We are called to seek forgiveness, to seek reconciliation boldly and often, all in the name of a love that totally transcends some narrow tightrope of moderation. What's more, Jesus comes to us with a grace. Jesus comes to us transcending even that simpler law. Even if we fall short of loving our neighbor as ourselves and loving God, we can seek forgiveness and know forgiveness in Jesus. Jesus comes to us with that grace, forgiving us when we fall short. Jesus comes to us when we try and fail. Jesus brings forgiveness. Jesus forgives us when we try and succeed and yet still find ourselves falling short. In all of this, we know true peace through Christ. We know that assurance of pardon. We know that abundant life. We know the new creation found in following Jesus, in living over and over again that cycle of forgiveness, that returning to God once again, that seeking reconciliation and loving our neighbors once more. We are called to live boldly into loving God, showing that love for our neighbors, loving truth, and showing that truth as well. In all of this, living life in Christ is still a burden. We are still burdened with that call. We are not freed to do whatever we want, ignoring God's command on us. But our life is not a tightrope walk between monsters on either side. Our life is not a place where we are trapped between rocks and hard places. Our life is not a catch-22. Our life does not end up with us condemned no matter what. Instead, it's a walk not between two monsters, but a walk with Jesus in our lives, in which our shortcomings are forgiven, in which our burdens are shared. In our text today, perhaps befitting this weekend that is a holiday weekend, even if it feels so different than it might otherwise. Jesus comes to me, comes to us, comes to all of us and says, "Come to me, all you who are weary and carrying heavy burdens, and I will give you rest." Thanks be to God. Alleluia. Amen.